welcome to the Sew Essential vlog. I'm Lucy and I'm here today to show you how to sew a flat fell seam. So this is most commonly found on jeans and men's shirts, and it's a way of encasing the raw edges of the seam allowances which will be on the inside of your garment. It's a way of encasing them in themselves so that there's no raw edges, and then they're usually neatly top stitched down, so it gives you a super professional finish. And as I said, they're most commonly found on jeans. So I'll just show you an example here. If you can see that seam there, that's the right side of the garment where it's been top stitched down. And then you can see on the wrong side of the garment, they're neatly encased inside. So lovely example of that there. And I'm also going to show you, although this is actually a lot easier than you might think, I'm also going to show you a cheats method as well to get the same appearance, but it's a little bit easier. So everything I use today is available on our site. You can find the link to our site below, but let's get started with the sewing. So here I've got the fabric and it's pinned wrong sides together. So we're breaking convention here and we're pinning the fabric wrong sides together. And I'm going to start by just sewing a normal seam. So I'm just reverse stitching at the start to secure everything, and then I'm sewing a 5/8 seam, which is just a standard seam allowance, but remember I'm sewing the fabric wrong sides together, which always feels a bit weird, but you'll see why eventually. All will be revealed. So let's just remove those pins, sew to the end, and then we're going to reverse stitch at the end as well. Okay, so everything's secured nicely there. And you can see we're just sewing that standard seam, wrong sides together. Now I'm going to take the fabric and I'm going to trim the seam allowances. Well, I'm going to trim one seam allowance to half, or maybe just less than half. Maybe about 1/8 of an inch, because what you're going to do then is we can press that seam open first, but then you're going to fold over the remaining seam allowance, which is still at its full width, and you're going to press that down. So I'm folding it over slightly, probably by about 1/8 of an inch, and just pressing that down in place. Just do that right to the end of the piece of fabric there. Press that down. And then the clever bit where everything gets encased and becomes nice and neat and tidy is that we fold that over the trimmed seam allowance, and then we press that down in place as well. So you can see that's folded over. The edge that I pressed under gives us that nice neat folded edge, and then I'm just pressing along that original seam allowance and pressing the folded edge down to secure everything. Then we're going to take that to the sewing machine, and we want to do that lovely top stitching now. So we just need to make sure that the fabric is folded over nicely, and that it's going to cover the trim seam allowance, and that it's going to cover the seam, and it's all going to be secured. And I'm going to start by top stitching next to the folded edge, so I'm doing this about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. As always, back stitching just to secure everything, and I'm using my seam marker foot, which has got little markings on it that give me different seam allowances, because you really want everything to be nice and parallel here. You want your top stitching to be really neat and parallel, and these feet and a 1/4 inch foot I sometimes use as well for that purpose. They're just great for getting lovely neat top stitching. And then I'm going to sew a parallel line of stitches next to that first line of stitches. And what I can do to make sure it's parallel with the first line of stitches is I can use this seam marker foot and just line one of the markers up with the line of stitches that I originally sewed, and follow that so that everything is beautifully parallel and looks really neat. because if you're going to top stitch something, it's going to be on display, and obviously you want it to look nice and neat. I'm using a contrasting thread here so you can see what I'm doing. Sometimes you might want to use a matching thread. I do like a contrasting thread though. There's something satisfying about a bit of top stitching. It just adds a pretty bit of detail, especially if you're making jeans or denim garments. It's just a nice traditional look. So I've reverse stitched at the end there again, and there you can see we've got two lovely parallel lines of stitches. Everything's nice and neat. The fold is secured in place, and then on the wrong side all of the raw edges are nice and secure and encased. So that was the traditional way of sewing a flat fell seam, and I hope you enjoyed that. But if you're somebody who might like to cut a corner or make life slightly easier, there is another cheats method which I promised to show you, which you can see on this denim skirt that I made here. So unfortunately the top stitching is the same colour pretty much as the skirt, but you can see there is the appearance of a flat fell seam on the right side of the garment. But then if we take a look inside, it's lovely and neat, but it's not encased in itself. There is one edge of the one of the seam allowances has been overlocked, and then that's been pressed over and top stitched down. So it's just an alternative method if anybody's a little bit scared of having a go at the flat fell seam, or just like me, sometimes you just want to do something that's a bit quicker but just as neat. So here I've got a piece of fabric sewn right sides together, just a normal seam sewn in the normal way, and I'm just going to overlock one of the seam allowances, which you can see I've done here. I use the overcasting stitch on the machine, and then I'm going to trim the next seam allowance down to half. So it's a similar principle really to the previous method. It's just that instead of folding under and pressing over, we're trimming one of the seam allowances and leaving one of them fully intact. And then I'm just going to press that seam open, and then I'm just going to fold the seam allowance with the overlocked edge, or I've used an overcasting stitch on a sewing machine here. Just press that down nice and neatly. And there we have it from the right side, just looks like a normal seam. And then we're going to take that over to the machine, and obviously we just need to secure that seam allowance in place now, and that will catch cover the trimmed seam allowance and keep everything nice and neat inside. Now you can stitch it from the right side or the wrong side of the garment depending on your preference. But I'm going to stitch from the right side of the garment. I'm using this seam marker foot again, just so I can get nice parallel straight top stitching. And I've just back stitched, and I'm using one of the markings to just follow that original seam line and top stitch that overlocked seam allowance in place, just back stitching again at the end to secure. And then once again I'm going to top stitch parallel to that, but you can see here that I've secured that seam allowance down, so I know that's not going anywhere. And then I'm going to top stitch parallel to that original line of stitching. So again, I can use my lovely seam marker foot to do this. It really is, this foot's really never off my machine unless I need to use another one for some specific task. It just is fantastic. It's so good. Really helps with the neatness of these sorts of tasks, I find. It just makes my life easier. I just find it so much easier than using a needle plate, and you wouldn't be able to use your needle plate here for this task. There are other feet you can use, but this is just the one that I like to use. So I'm just back stitching there, and you can see I've still got that lovely flat fell seam effect on the right side. You can put those lines of stitching however wide apart you want them, as long as it catches the seam allowances, and it looks nice and neat inside as well. So I hope you've enjoyed those tutorials today. If you did like what you see, please like and subscribe to our channel where you'll find lots more tutorials, regular updates about new sewing patterns, new dressmaking fabrics, lots of sewing inspiration. We share what we've been making and also reviews as well. As I mentioned at the start of the video, everything I used today is available on our site, and we've put the link to our site below, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.